Every nation promises to defend its money. Every citizen believes that what's written on a note will still mean something tomorrow. And yet, again and again, the guardians of currency become its destroyers, not with guns or riots, but with signatures and speeches that tell you everything is under control while value quietly drains from your wallet. This is the story of the United States, how the richest nation on earth turned gold into paper, trust into illusion, and prosperity into a moving target. Most people remember the Great Depression through black and white photos, men standing in bread lines, families leaving dust-blown farms. What they rarely notice is the quieter disaster playing out in the bank vaults. In 1933, the country's money didn't just lose value, it lost its anchor. At the start of that decade, a $20 bill wasn't just paper. It was a promise. You could walk into any bank and redeem it for 1 ounce of gold. That pledge had survived wars, booms, and panics since the 1870s, but promises are expensive when times go bad. As global trade collapsed and banks began to fail, Americans did what frightened depositors have done for centuries. They ran to gold. The government's gold reserves drained with every withdrawal. Officials blamed hoarders, but the truth was simpler. People no longer trusted the promise. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office in March 1933, the country's faith in money was evaporating. In his first radio address, he told Americans that the crisis demanded bold action. Bold meant something few imagined: the confiscation of the nation's private gold. Executive Order 6102, the bland bureaucratic title of one of the most radical financial decrees in U.S. history, made it illegal for citizens to own more than a token amount of monetary gold. Within weeks, holders were required to turn their coins and bullion over to the Federal Reserve at a fixed price of $20.67 per ounce. The government promised that compliance was patriotic. The newspapers printed reassuring headlines about stability returning. But beneath the slogans lay a direct transfer of wealth. Anyone who surrendered gold at the official price would soon learn that the same government had no intention of keeping that price. In January 1934, the Gold Reserve Act quietly revalued gold to 35 an ounce, a 69% increase. The math was simple and brutal. Every citizen who donned over their metal at 35 an ounce, a 69% increase. The math was simply andrond. If every citizen en Wavtonda na 20.67 had just lost 1/3 of its real worth overnight. The government, meanwhile, saw its gold reserves swell in value by billions. Devaluation was sold as national recovery. In practice, it was the largest forced wealth shift in modern American history. No newspapers screamed theft because the process looked technical, even benevolent. Dollars became cheaper relative to gold. Exports rose. The economy seemed to stir. But ordinary savers paid the bill in silence. The purchasing power of the currency in their pockets shrank, and the link between their labor and lasting value was broken. From that moment, the American people no longer owned their money. They merely used it at the state's discretion. The symbolism ran deep. For generations, gold had been both money and myth, a metallic promise that value was real, physical, limited by nature. The New Deal's paper revival looked progressive, yet underneath was a lesson older than Rome. When governments face insolvency, they change the definition of wealth. The people still held dollars, they just no longer decided what those dollars were worth. Most Americans at the time cheered Roosevelt's recovery policies, unaware that they'd witnessed the first act of a long play. The Great Devaluation wasn't an event. It was a mindset shift, the discovery that prosperity could be manufactured by decree. Once that idea took root, there would be no going back. Through the 1930s and 1940s, the federal government learned to treat money not as metal, but as management. Gold still sat in Fort Knox and New York Fed vaults, yet its role had changed. It now backed confidence rather than circulation, a psychological pillar rather than a public right. And when war returned in 1939, that psychological anchor became a strategic weapon. As Europe tore itself apart, The United States became the supplier of everything: food, aircraft, munitions. Gold poured in from exhausted allies who paid in metal because their paper was no longer trusted. For the first time, the U.S. was not merely productive, it was the world's clearinghouse. By 1944, two-thirds of the world's monetary gold rested under the American flag. Allied leaders gathering in a small New Hampshire resort called Bretton Woods tried to design a monetary system that would prevent future chaos. What they planned seemed orderly, a kind of return to reason, but it would cement the very power shift that Roosevelt's decree had begun. At Bretton Woods in 1944, the delegates wanted to avoid another monetary collapse like the one that had deepened the Great Depression. They drew up a blueprint that looked solid and logical. Currencies would be pegged to the U.S. dollar, and the dollar itself would be redeemable for gold at $35 an ounce. In theory, gold still guaranteed stability. In practice, trust in America guaranteed it even more. The world's wealth now revolved around paper promises printed in Washington. It was a beautiful illusion. The plan allowed other nations to hold dollars instead of gold as their reserves. That convenience seemed harmless, even efficient, but it transferred a kind of quiet sovereignty from every central bank on earth to the Federal Reserve. Each ounce of gold in Fort Knox now supported not just American money but global trade. The U.S. had become banker to the world, a role as intoxicating as it was precarious. For 20 years the arrangement worked mostly. Europe rebuilt, corporations multiplied. Suburban lawns sprouted like post-war mushrooms. Behind the prosperity stood the same structure Roosevelt had created, paper underpinned by faith. The difference was scale. When American exports boomed in the 1950s, dollars flowed overseas. Those dollars, held by central banks from London to Tokyo, were supposed to be as good as gold. But by the early 1960s, the numbers no longer matched the metal. Every year, the U.S. printed more dollars than its gold reserves could possibly redeem. The difference was invisible to ordinary citizens, but obvious to accountants in Paris and Zurich. Gold in U.S. vaults slipped from 20,000 tons to barely half that by 1971, while dollars multiplied without limit. Yet Washington reassured the world that everything was fine. The illusion of permanence endured until someone called the bluff. That someone was Charles de Gaulle, President of France. Proud, nationalist, and allergic to American dominance, he ordered his treasury to convert surplus dollars into gold. Shipments of bullion moved across the Atlantic by the ton. It was a gesture both symbolic and terrifying. If other countries followed, U.S. gold would vanish. Every government knew the same truth but preferred not to face it. De Gaulle said it aloud. The emperor's currency had no close. Through the 1960s, economists in the U.S. debated the dollar shortage and the dollar glut, both phrases describing the same paradox. America's prosperity depended on exporting dollars. Those dollars funded global trade and eroded faith in the dollar's own backing. It was a self-defeating engine. As foreign confidence slipped, so did domestic restraint. Presidents promised guns and butter, war and welfare, without raising taxes to pay for them. Vietnam devoured billions. The Great Society added billions more. The Treasury quietly absorbed it all with credit, not coin. By summer 1971, the numbers had become absurd. Dollars in circulation outnumbered the gold that could redeem them by double digits. If France, Germany, or Japan demanded payment, American vaults would empty in weeks. Inside the White House, secret meetings debated the unthinkable. To confess the system was untenable would trigger panic. To defend it honestly would break the bank. The solution was political theater. On an August Sunday evening, President Richard Nixon interrupted television programming with a solemn address. He used the language of emergency and patriotism, phrases Roosevelt himself might have written, to announce that henceforth the United States will suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. The word temporarily was meant to soothe. In reality, the gold window was closing forever. Within hours, the foundation of global finance changed. The $35 promise was dead. Gold would float freely. The dollar would be sustained by confidence alone. A few newspaper headlines called it historic. Most Americans shrugged. Their paychecks looked the same. Their bank balances hadn't changed. But under the surface, the relationship between money and value snapped. Inflation followed like a shadow. In 1971, a dollar still bought a gallon of gasoline. By 1981, it took four. It wasn't just oil. Everything that could be measured in honest effort, bread, tuition, homes, rose in nominal price while falling in real worth. Savers who kept their earnings in bank accounts watched them evaporate quietly, a repeat of 1933 without the confiscation forms. The theft was invisible, legal, and universal. The administration blamed profiteers, unions, and foreign manipulation. Yet the cause lay in plain sight. Once gold stopped anchoring policy, restraint stopped as well. Governments had learned the secret of painless debt. You don't default, you devalue. Issue more dollars, shift the price level, and call it growth. Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns watched the numbers with dread. He tried wage and price controls, commanding by decree what the market had already discovered, that fiat money drifts like smoke once unmoored. Businesses ignored the orders. Shelves emptied. Black markets bloomed. The edict died quietly, as Descartes' logic and Diocletian's law before it. You can regulate behavior, not belief. Then came the energy shocks of 1973 and 1979, when oil exporters realized they too could print a kind of money, not on paper, but in barrels. As the dollar slid and the price of oil quadrupled, Washington struck a new bargain to preserve its supremacy. Petroleum would be traded worldwide only in dollars. The petrodollar replaced the gold standard with an energy standard, keeping global demand for American currency alive. It was clever diplomacy masquerading as economics. The world once again trusted the dollar not because it was stable, but because there was no alternative. Back home, trust thinned. Ordinary Americans watched wages lag behind prices. A generation raised to save found itself punished for prudence. Checking accounts yielded nothing while inflation devoured 10–12% a year. Retirement plans based on fixed pensions cracked. Those who understood the game moved assets into real estate and stocks, trading stability for speculation. Those who didn't fell behind. By the early 1980s, the phrase inflation psychology entered policy papers, a telling confession that money had become belief management. The Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker finally slammed the brakes with double-digit interest rates, breaking the spiral at the cost of recession. Economists celebrated the victory. Few noticed that Americans now accepted permanent inflation as normal. The Great Devaluation had completed its education. Value is what we say it is, until we say otherwise. Meanwhile, gold, once dismissed as a barbarous relic, refused to die. After Nixon's announcement, its price exploded from R35 to over 35 to over 800 an ounce by 1980. The metal's surge wasn't greed. It was memory. Generations of savers recognized instinctively that trust, not supply, defined worth. When paper confidence wanes, people seek atoms. Policymakers derided it as irrational. Markets called it insurance. Through each administration, the pattern persisted. Deficits justified by crisis, promises justified by faith. From Roosevelt's decree to Nixon's suspension, the same quiet principle endured. The easiest way to reduce debt is to cheapen the money it's measured in. Governments, like borrowers, discovered they could erase obligations not by paying them, but by redefining the unit of account. The trick was psychological and absolute. Keep people earning, spending, and voting faster than prices rose, and they'd call inflation growth, not loss. By the mid-1980s, America stood triumphant again. Inflation subsided, stock indices climbed, and the dollar reigned supreme. Few remembered that its throne was made of trust alone. Behind the computer screens and credit cards, behind the bright commercials promising prosperity, lay the same paradox Roosevelt and Nixon had both exploited. The nation's wealth depends on everyone believing the lie at the same time. By the mid-1980s, the storm seemed to have passed. Mortgage rates fell, markets rose, and the nation convinced itself that discipline had been restored. Wall Street rang with optimism. The dollar, that battered symbol of faith, once again became the world's favorite mirror. But the victory over inflation carried a hidden cost. To defeat runaway prices, policymakers had squeezed the economy with record-high interest rates. To restart growth, they now opened the spigots of credit. Debt ceased to be shameful, it became patriotic. Borrowing was rebranded as confidence in the American dream. Corporate raiders, leveraged bailouts, and a blizzard of financial innovation appeared almost overnight. Where gold once anchored value, collateral now did. Banks invented new instruments, each promising safety while concealing leverage. The public bought the narrative whole. Why hoard metal in a vault when a home in the suburbs seemed to appreciate automatically? During the Reagan years, the national debt tripled, yet voters celebrated prosperity. Few noticed that deficits and devaluation are merely opposite sides of the same coin. One adds numbers to the ledger, the other shrinks their meaning. The magician's trick works best when the audience loves the illusion. The 1990s transformed that illusion into policy. Computers, the internet, and globalization flooded the country with cheaper goods. Walmart prices masked monetary expansion. Imported productivity disguised domestic inflation. As Asian manufacturers churned out electronics and clothes, the U.S. printed the dollars to buy them, exporting paper and importing value. Both sides felt enriched. American households piled on credit. Foreign central banks recycled their earnings into U.S. treasuries. The circle was complete. Dollars left America and returned as loans to fund more American spending. Politicians of both parties called it a miracle. Economists gave it a name, the Great Moderation. Prices were stable, recession rare. But moderation was an illusion born of substitution. Instead of prices rising, quality quietly shrank. Smaller packages, thinner metal, shorter warranties. $1 still bought a 20-can pack of soda. Nobody counted the ounces missing from each can. People had stopped thinking about what money measured because money had become the measurement of everything else. Then came 2001. When the Twin Towers fell, the country entered the longest war in its history and financed it entirely with credit. Taxes didn't rise, borrowing did. The lesson learned in 1933 returned to life. Crisis justifies creation. Trillions in new obligations materialized off-book, hidden behind patriotic language. Citizens were told to shop, not sacrifice. The war economy of the 21st century was not fought with ration cards, but with rewards points. Meanwhile, the housing boom swelled. Interest rates dropped to near zero, a policy engineered to keep the illusion alive. Home equity became the new gold standard, a store of value fueled by debt. American families felt wealthier each year, not because productivity soared, but because paper valuations rose faster than memory. They didn't notice the shift. Savings replaced by speculation, employment replaced by extraction. By 2006, even cab drivers discussed mortgage derivatives. Banks packaged loans into bonds, sold them to pension funds, and insured them with promises that couldn't be met. Every layer of the tower depended on confidence and cheap money pumped from the same source that had once guarded gold. When the tide went out in 2008, everything built on leverage collapsed. Institutional titans fell overnight. Markets convulsed. For a moment it seemed as though America might finally face the reckoning postponed since 1971. Instead, it performed the oldest ritual in monetary history, salvation through devaluation. The Federal Reserve unleashed quantitative easing, a polite phrase for manufacturing money to buy broken assets. Within months, trillions of new dollars appeared in electronic form. Officials insisted it was temporary, targeted, scientific. They called it liquidity, as though value were a liquid one could simply pour into empty vessels. The rescue worked spectacularly for some. Asset prices recovered faster than wages. The wealthiest 10%, who owned most stocks and real estate, grew richer than ever. The lower half, who relied on savings accounts and salaries, found their purchasing power stagnant. The gap wasn't an accident, it was the mechanism of the cure. When money expands faster than labor, ownership wins. For the first time since Roosevelt, Americans began to suspect that inflation could exist even without rising prices. The evidence hid in balance sheets rather than grocery bills. A college education cost double within a decade. Healthcare became a mortgage in disguise. Homes returned to being speculative chips. Inflation had changed its face from too many dollars chasing goods to too much credit chasing assets. It rewarded the indebted and punished the prudent, the same great devaluation, repeating in slow motion. Policymakers congratulated themselves on preventing depression to point zero. Stock indices set records again. The headlines proclaimed recovery, but the recovery carried the familiar echo of the 1930s and the 1970s, paper wealth soaring against eroding fundamentals. For every new dollar generated by the system, an equal promise was created to tax the future. Politicians discovered they could spend without limit so long as the borrowed money produced an appearance of growth before the next election. The debt itself had become the product. By 2010, a new generation came of age that had never seen a bank savings rate above 2%. To them, volatility in markets replaced patience, speculation replaced thrift. The financial system no longer needed gold because it had social media to manufacture confidence by algorithm rather than bullion. Charts, forecasts, and endless talk of liquidity replaced the old vocabulary of restraint. The illusion was safe as long as belief remained seamless. Yet belief, like currency, is elastic only to a point. For decades, Americans had been paid in money that bought less every year while being told they were richer. Median household income stagnated, but asset prices climbed. Politicians pointed to the average as proof of progress. Few realized averages can rise even when most fall. The Great Devaluation was not a single event, but an atmosphere, the slow theft of time disguised as stability. If the 1930s confiscated gold and the 1970s confiscated trust, the 2000s confiscated patience. The timeline of reward collapsed. Investors demanded quarterly miracles. Citizens demanded instant stimulus. The culture refused to wait, and in doing so, it forgot what waiting was for. Money had always been a measurement of time labor stored for future need. Now the future was merely collateral for the present. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, once measured in hundreds of billions, crossed the first trillion, then 3, then 7. Each expansion was a promise that could never shrink again without pain. Officials explained that they were creating stability. They were right, a stability whose cost would emerge only when confidence cracked. By the late 2010s, America had completed an 80-year metamorphosis. From a nation that once feared inflation, it had become a nation that required it. A steady drift of prices upward was treated as health, not decay. Like oxygen, it was invisible until withdrawn. In that atmosphere, entire generations learned to confuse nominal numbers with progress. $1 million home became the new symbol of success, though the mortgage owed on it guaranteed a lifetime of servitude. Wealth and debt had fused, prosperity and dependency had become synonyms. Then, in 2020, a tiny virus exposed the system's fragility once again. In a few months, the U.S. government created as many dollars as it had in its first 2 centuries combined. Checks arrived in mailboxes, markets rebounded before hospitals emptied, and commentaries hailed a new era of modern monetary theory, the open declaration that deficits no longer mattered. For the third time since 1933, the country redefined reality by printing it. When the lockdown years ended, prices told the truth. Food costs more, fuel costs more, rent and hope costs more. Americans debated why: corporate greed, supply chains, labor shortages, but the cause was the same silent mechanism that had operated for generations. Inflation is the kindest name for confiscation. The digits increase, the substance thins. What governments learned during the Depression had become doctrine. Rescuing the economy means redistributing invisible value from everyone who saves to everyone who spends. By 2021, inflation had returned with a vengeance. Officials called it transitory, a word designed to pacify fears while resetting expectations. But for the first time in a generation, the theft became visible again. Groceries, cars, lumber, rent all leapt upward. The numbers on paychecks rose too, but slower, as always. A lifetime of quiet dilution now had a smell, a weight, a taste. Families who had done everything right suddenly saw the arithmetic change. The down payment they'd saved for a decade bought half as much house. Retirees on fixed incomes clipped coupons again. The young learned that saving in dollars was a slow form of self-betrayal. Yet nothing burned down, no vaults were raided. The robbery was mathematical, the denominator of value expanding faster than anyone could count. Politicians presented stimulus packages as generosity. Central banks described balance sheet expansion as prudence. The language softened the act. Printing was now quantitative accommodation. Deficits were investments in resilience. The vocabulary of finance, once precise, had become euphemistic art, the poetry of plausible theft. Some investors sought refuge in the same metal their grandparents had been forced to surrender. Gold prices surged, faded, and surged again. Others fled to code, Bitcoin, Ethereum, digital myths of incorruptible scarcity. Each asset told the same story in a new dialect, that trust in paper was ending, that the ledger must be beyond politics. Yet even the digital promised what gold once did, independence from decree. Meanwhile, the architects of the system proposed an even tighter circle, central bank digital currencies, money issued directly by the state in programmable form. To their designers it was efficiency, to skeptics, the perfection of control. A CBDC would eliminate counterfeits, simplify taxation, fight corruption at least on paper. But it would also erase the last private corner of money. In place of banknotes anonymous in the hand, we would hold traceable tokens of approval. Monetary history had come full circle, from the tangible weight of gold to the abstract signature of electrons, each step trading freedom from management. The ordinary saver again stands where every Roman, Frenchman, or American once stood, trusting the system while sensing the floor beneath shifting grain by grain. It is easy to see past collapses as moral tales about other people in distant centuries. It is harder to recognize that the same script is unfolding in real time on our screens and debit cards. Imagine explaining to a citizen of 1910 that her wage, safely stored in a bank account, would lose 90% of its purchasing power by her great-grandchild's adulthood, not through confiscation or conquest, but through policy. She would think you were describing a crime. We call it economic management. The Great Devaluation is not some apocalyptic event waiting to happen. It is the condition we inhabit. Every paycheck denominated in a currency that buys less each year, the vote of confidence in a promise already broken. The government no longer needs to seize gold to drain wealth. It does so quietly with each new budget, each stimulus, each whisper from the Federal Reserve announcing support for markets, and yet the system persists because belief persists. Prosperity still glitters on the surface, booming stock markets, record corporate profits, the illusion of abundance. But behind the ticker symbols lies an ocean of debt that will never be repaid, only rolled forward and disguised by new digits. The wonder is not that people trust it, but that they must. In complex economies, disbelief itself can trigger collapse. Faith has become infrastructure. Every historical cycle ends the same way, with disbelief finally outweighing convenience. In the 1930s it was bank runs. In the 1970s, inflation panic. In the 2008 crisis, frozen credit. The next break may not look like any of these. It might come not from scarcity, but from saturation, too much money chasing too little meaning. When every promise has been diluted, Only reality can restore discipline, and reality is never kind. Yet collapse, as history shows, is renewal by another name. Each time trust evaporates, new systems rise. The survivors are those who understand that real wealth lies in what money only measures: land, skill, usefulness, community, and time. In every crisis, those resources remain priceless because they cannot be printed. So, what happens when the next reckoning arrives? Perhaps nothing cinematic, no breadlines, no shuttered banks. Perhaps just a generation quietly recalculating what matters, turning away from numbers towards substance. The digital age offers tools to do both good and harm: decentralized currencies, local production, energy independence. The choice, as always, belongs to those who refuse to sleep through the warning. Look backward and the pattern glows. 1933, gold confiscated. 1971, gold abandoned. 2008, debt monetized. 2020, limits discarded entirely. Each step meant as rescue, each step working for a while. Then inflation whispered, savings shrank, inequality widened, and citizens adapted, because adaptation is easier than rebellion. The theft succeeded precisely because it felt normal. When historians of the future trace this era's collapse, they will not find explosions or riots as the cause. They will note a long consent as civilization that accepted gradual debasement as progress, that measured success in rising digit rather than living standards, that mistook liquidity for wealth. If there is a silver lining, it is awareness. Knowledge itself is protection. To see the pattern is to break its spell. A citizen who understands the history of devaluation cannot be easily pacified by slogans. He knows that strong dollar and temporary inflation phrases of persuasion, not fact. He learns to hold some of his wealth outside the system, to value productive skills over paper yield, to remember that freedom in finance, like in politics, begins with skepticism. For nearly a century, the United States has practiced the art of taking without appearing to take, transforming every financial emergency into justification for dilution. The victims were never defeated armies or gold investors. They were ordinary people who trusted savings accounts more than memory. The mechanism is elegant, no printing press needed in view, just credit expansion and the slow mercy of inflation. From the day gold lost its legal power to the moment you check your online balance, the lesson persists. Value is never guaranteed. The authority that creates your money gains most when you forget that simple truth. The greatest heist in history didn't need a thief in the night. It required economists in daylight explaining why depreciation is opportunity. The true question has never been whether governments will devalue, they always will, but whether citizens will notice in time to protect themselves. The day gold lost its power was not a turning point long ago. It was the first rehearsal for now. So measure your wealth not in currency, but in resilience. Remember that every promise printed by power eventually costs the people who believe it most. History calls that collapse. Economists call it adjustment. Politicians call it progress. You call it what it is. And if this story changed how you see the bills in your hand or the numbers on your screen, remember, recognition is the first defense. Because the great devaluation never ends, it only waits for the next believer.